Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Jimenez. I'm your executive director for the Tampa Bay International Gay and Lesbian Film Festival. On behalf of the board, staff, and volunteers, welcome to our Q&A for Framing Agnes as part of our A-List monthly screening series. And from Framing Agnes, we are proud to welcome director Chase Joint. Chase, welcome.
Thank you.
And then also we're going to have, part of it is our community programmer for this film, Nathan Broomer. Nathan, welcome.
Hello.
All right. Well, Chase, again, thank you for taking the time today to be part of this Q&A. Our audience just finished watching the film, and I'm sure they enjoyed it. What they may or may not know, and then I kind of want to, my first question is, this was actually originally a short film that you then, I think in 2019, and then you then expanded into a film. So can you, I guess it's a two-part question, tell us the history of why you initially created the short film, and then what got you to then make it a feature-length documentary?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a winding road of a story. So I'll try to keep it as short as possible. But the easiest way to answer your question is we made a short because we didn't have any money. And we knew that we had an extraordinary opportunity to work with this archival material, and really took the short as an opportunity to prove concept, to prove method, to say it's possible to tell stories about trans history in innovative ways that break us out of some of the literal boxes that we've been in through various kinds of representational practice. And so we were able to work with 4 of our 6 actors in the short form version of the film. And we're so lucky to be able to welcome Jen and Steven into the feature. And we were really able to elevate and escalate some of the questions that we were asking in the short, to invest in production design, to produce the film that you just watched.
No, great. And then kind of like a quick follow-up from that is, how did you initially discover the archival footage from UCLA?
So there is a variety of different places where you can find this kind of archival material. Some of it is located in the public holdings of UCLA, which is where Jules is speaking to us from in the film. But through a series of very fortunate events, Kristen and I ended up in the private archival holdings of Harold Garfinkel. After his death, his belongings were being organized and sorted by another sociologist and colleague of his. And we went to a small coastal town time and time again, helping to sort the boxes. And true to the story in the film, we opened a very rusty old filing cabinet to uncover all of the files that become the source matter for the film.
Nathan.
Yeah. Does Chase know, Victor, what like the timing of the film, or like what the A-list approach is? Like your ask of me in choosing a film?
No, I don't actually think so. It's going to go I guess for our audience also, the A-List is a monthly screening series that the Tampa Festival started, and then we basically asking different members of the community, prominent members of the community, to pick the film that meant something to them. Old film, new film, whatever type of film. So in February we had Nadine Smith from Equality, Florida, and then she picked a lesbian romantic comedy, the incredible true stories of 2 girls in love. And then we asked Nathan to pick the film for March, and he chose Framing Agnes.
Yeah, I asked you to sort of set that up because when I think back over the years, and I'm going to ask this question, I guess, in 2 parts for Chase, because I'm curious, why you chose to get into film, but we're also doing this in March ahead of Trans Day of Visibility. Mm-hmm. And part of the conversation with Victor and other friends of mine, connected with the festival, with like, what films really impacted your life as you were growing up as a trans human? And I really struggled to find any films that were representing trans masculine voices. And I know about some of your other work. And then this film was introduced to me by a fabulous woman over at the Gasparilla Film Festival. And I was like, wow, I don't know all of my own history, because those stories are yet to be uncovered. And so through watching this film, sort of creating a lot of questions in my mind, but the journey continues, I guess, what other metal boxes you may uncover. But I'm curious about these telling of stories a bit more. And I guess I feel like asking you, were there films early on? Like what sparked you in pursuing this career wise? And I know you have a great website and I've seen some of your other projects. And I'm just sort of curious about that journey for you as well.
Yeah, I love that. Well, first of all, thank you for choosing our film. So deeply appreciative. And I feel like in service of whoever's watching this link at a later time, we should also say that we connected through screens at a Q&A of the film recently, and the experience has really stuck with me ever since. It really sort of lives in my body as a very important moment of connection, and I appreciate it very much. And it's a great question. I think that there's two different ways I can answer it. So I have always been an artistic person. I was an artistic kid. Um, I went to theater school, but really quickly in college became enmeshed in activist communities who were agitating and activating around sexual and gender-based violence. And I started making moving image work in part because of the lack of moving image projects about trans and gender nonconforming subjects and communities that made sense to me. And when I think about the films that really allowed me to see a way forward, or the films that taught me that cultural production was a mechanism through which we could activate social change, it's really AIDS activist videos made out of a sense of urgent need to communicate first with those who were most impacted by the socio-political climates, and then to broader publics, right? It was a community first, public second negotiation that was always being sort of toggled between on screen. And I carry some of those early strategies with me in my thinking about transness on screen. And a lot of my work is thinking deeply about collaboration and is pushing back against the kind of solo authored authority of trans history and of, frankly, documentary more broadly. And I think about early cohort docs about transmasculine history. So films like Southern Comfort that came out in 2000, which chronicles the life and death of Robert Eads, a trans man who's dying of ovarian cancer, essentially due to the neglect of the medical industrial complex. But one of the things that's so extraordinary about Robert's story in the context of that film is that he is doubled and mirrored and supported by a real cohort of trans identified friends and lovers and chosen family. I think about Daniel Peddle's The Aggressives, which came out in 2005, years after Southern Comfort, which is a portrait doc of Black and brown transmasculine people living in New York, and features one of my faves of all time, Marquise Vilson, who is an actor and who appears in my film No Ordinary Man. So if we had a lot more time, I could keep riffing with you, but I think that the films that really stay with me are films where you cannot leave the story thinking about only one person, that you're always left with a multiplicity of experience and understanding.
Absolutely. I feel like Framing Agnes absolutely continues that. I mean, as you were describing, pursuing this for community first and then for the public, I was remembering, I think, Jules's sort of tension as an individual, as a historian, right? And I'm an advocate, and I'm out doing public policy work, and I'm often challenged by my personal experience versus the work, and that where that tension is to stay neutral sometimes and having really difficult conversations. I'm curious, as the project was moving, how that tension sort of came about or evolved, or if it was there all the time. Some of her observations are really brilliant.
Jules Gill Peterson is a star. And I think one of the things that you get to see on screen is Jules really working out that tension with us. And so one of the ways she's able to do that is not only because she's an extraordinary historian and thinker and activist who's been working with the material for a long time, but also because right before we went to camera, I showed Jules string outs of the film in progress. So I said things in a living room of an Airbnb in LA. Here's how we're thinking about jobs. Here's where we go when we're talking about love. Here's how we're trying to pull in UCLA as a character. And in turns, Jules was saying things like, yeah, so interesting, or Really? Well, if we make that choice, then here's the consequences of that choice. And here's what we would need to do, or here's what we would need to explain, or here's what we would need to reveal. And so it was really through a real time, ongoing process of revision that Jules is commenting on exactly what you in the audience are seeing. And it's from that point that me as a maker, I was able to change the story on the fly to better attend to some of the consequences of the choices. And I use the word consequences strategically because editing is a series of choices that produce effects. And so for all the ways in which you're watching a film that puts A alongside B, you put A alongside C and you change the meaning. And so we were together trying to chart a course where we felt like we could arrive in the world with a film that we were ready and willing and excited to stand up and continue to converse about.
Yeah. I was curious about how the process sort of went forward. Was there a big surprise from you for you and where you started or where you thought you might go that turned it around? I mean, was there anything that was sort of a big unexpected thing for you?
Yeah, what's interesting is that I can actually tie it into the first question about the relationship between the short and the feature.
Mhm.
And to me, while we are using the same archival source material, if you were to sit with both of the projects, you would obviously see the relation between them, but I think you would be taken aback by the differences. And in part, the differences exist because of the change in the socio-political climate between when we shot the short in 2018 and we arrived with the feature in 2022. And the short really relies upon personal narrative as the way in which we pivot between these times, between the relationship between the contemporary actor and the historical subject. And I think that we've arrived in a moment where many transcultural producers are tired of telling personal stories and are watching the ways in which personal stories have been co-opted by the non-trans media and medical industrial complexes to sort of keep us in place and to try to contain our stories for various political agendas. And so I think collectively in the feature, we're pushing back against those tendencies that want to consume and contain our lives and say, well, what if we told this story from a variety of different vantage points that were not deeply rooted in only the personal? How can we stay thinking about these structural and institutional powers? And so it can be a strange and disorienting experience. And I think sometimes people will say, oh, but I wanted to spend more time getting to know the intricacies of people's personal lives and histories. And I think collectively we're like, well, of course that's your impulse because we are all trained by a media machine that says that the personal is the only way through which we can empathetically attach. And I think we're tired of arguing for our dignity on those terms.
That's a whole lot to unpack, Chase. But truth. I mean, and I know this is going to live on beyond, just this moment. But I think you've been paying attention to sort of the political moment we're in Florida. So I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that because I mean, I think I'm personally sort of recovering, and I think other folks are still trying to unpack exactly what the session here in Florida will mean, and as other legislative sessions are continuing forward. So sort of tying in, I think, film as storytelling and as education and as advocacy and as activism and all those things. A big part of the narrative in the political has been that, we as transhumans are new, and it's also very much focused on children. And so to find historical narratives from 60, 70, 80 years ago, to me, is really relevant and significant. I don't know, as an outsider to the Florida political scene, but what you've sort of seen, um, speak a little bit to that as opposed to this other reality that we're struggling with. I'd be just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, and maybe it's an opportunity for me to ask a question of you as well, if we can sort of flip the organization of this. So I think one of the things we always say is like trans people have always existed, right? It doesn't really matter the words that you use or the containers in which we live. We are trying to think about the contexts in which our stories have been erased or revised or hidden. But I think that when we think about the relationship between Framing Agnes and the current legislative agendas in a variety of different places, we always imagined our film to be hopefully useful, right? As a way in which to point to various questions. And so I'm curious, as someone who arrived in the crowd in the early days of our film being in the world, like, how can we be thinking together about the work that we're doing in the film and the work that you're doing on the ground there? Like, what arrives for you as a possibility?
Yeah, well, I think having worked with youth a lot, what I'm often asked is about their future, right? There's often a need for reassurance beyond just the campaign, right? It gets better. And and so when I feel, and also as a teacher, maybe this, I'm like harkening back to things that have worked in the past, which is literally knowing our past. So knowing that we're more than just this moment right now, and that there are these other fascinating histories through remarkable periods of time. I mean, I just think like the fashion from the 50s, like, I don't know, I just, the fanciness that men and women were, I really love that time frame. I don't know
Totally.
why. And also folks need to go check out No Ordinary Man as well, by the way. I have to put in a plug. I also love, like, old jazz clubs. I mean, I just don't know what that would have been like to live at that time period.
Yeah.
But I find it grounding, and I find the chaos of the advocacy I do exhausting. And
Mm-hmm.
being a young human in this world, I mean, I remember sort of my internal struggles. um, I'd like to think if I saw these stories from folks a whole lot older than me, it would have been comforting then, because it is now, and I'm making that assumption. And I just want to know other stories, because the who we are as individuals is as varied as the films that you're going to make over a lifetime. And there could be, music, and there can be just housewives. I mean, like some of the
Yeah.
folks, right, just regular folk doing regular things. And you can do so much in an hour and a half in film. I mean, a lot of the folks coming to the film are, folks, friends that I know, but they will learn so much more through these narratives. I think continuing looking at the reality of today through yesterday is probably a really important thing to do. I don't think this year is its only tough year for us politically. I'm pretty sure we're going to need some more stories.
I totally agree with you. And one of the things that I love to continue thinking about as it relates to the archives that inform our work in Agnes is all of the ways in which trans people are actually the experts of their own experience. And trans people are the ones who hold the knowledge of community and of what we need in order to thrive and survive. And so there's those amazing moments that even exist in our film where someone like Barbara is schooling Garfinkel on the landscape of surgeons and surgery in North America, or the recognition that she knows where trans women are meeting in LA to skill share and to resource share. And she's going to hold back some of that information from him to protect that space of trans possibility. Or, the person that Silas Howard is inhabiting, Denny, walks into Garfinkel's office and says something like, I go to the Hollywood Hills and I go to parties where there's 200 lesbians. And Garfinkel is like not even imagining that there are 200 lesbians that would congregate, let alone all have the right address in Hollywood Hills. And I just like, these are moments in the mid-century where queer and trans people are finding each other and building worlds. And I source a lot of power and possibility from that, because that's still what we're still holding back information about our lives and strategies from people in power who are not out to help or assist us, right? And I think that kind of like push and play between public and private is is so key.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then I wonder, so, sometimes I have stepped away from sort of the personal storytelling when I'm talking about the work more
Yeah.
broadly. And every once in a while, or at least more recently, I've been very, I've been comfortable and open to being vulnerable and sharing those. And there are people I've known doing the work for decades who I'll tell a story to, and they're like, "You've never told me that story before." Like, who I've known for decades. And I had an incident in Chicago at the airport where I was pulled out of the women's room before transitioning by law enforcement very violently. And this leading activist, very well known, I hadn't shared that story ever. And I didn't get into the why. It was just sort of this moment, and we sort of, carried on with the other small talk we were having. But there are a lot of those, which then makes me think, knowing that we're roughly the same age, in a few more years, are there stories from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that have yet to be told, and what in the world will they be?
Yeah.
Or what will these stories today be by the filmmakers 50 years from now?
I can't wait to find out. I mean, I agree with you. I think that there's so much possibility, and I think for me, I hope that if we can project out a fantasy of what those stories will be, for me, my hope is that we completely obliterate the silos in which work is made, such that we have, trans films that aren't also trans films and films about abolition and films about, right? Like, we need to be thinking across axes of intersectional difference in much more complex ways. And I hope that our storytelling reveals a deep engagement with the fact that we can't be separated out into these categories, and that we always have to be thinking across.
Yeah. So I think I'd also like to pose the question about, for you as a filmmaker, like, accessibility, and getting your films out. I mean, I know a few years ago when I was seeking films, and I have a friend, and Tiglif is one of the partners that created the Tampa Bay Transgender Film Festival. We struggled to find broader content, and even just in the last few years, there's much more. So from writers to actors to directors to producers, but involvement of trans folks within film, and more broadly, what's your observation sort of, and where we're at visibility wise? And I mean, I think there have been a lot of folks doing film. We find out later, oh, they happen to be trans, but they've been in film all along. And somebody sort of on the inside, what is your experience, or how what sort of role or importance does that play? Because I know I've heard a lot of discussion from folks within the industry that we need more of these stories, but we also have some hurdles in ensuring folks like you get to tell these stories.
Totally. Yeah. And I feel like we could have a whole nother Zoom chat about this question, because it's really complex. But I think that one of the things that I feel most excited about is that the trans and gender nonconforming creatives who are in positions of industrial power in a variety of different ways, in my experience, are very invested in kicking that door open and keeping it open, and trying to race as many people through as possible. So if you get a director gig, you're trying to crew up with your friends and your peers and other people who you understand have been excluded from these circuits of knowing, because it's all citational, right? So the ways in which people get work is because they know, because they have a friend, because they've been something, right? It's all of this, oh, I have a person. But if you are outside the bounds of these kinds of connective threads, you're never going to be referenced in those circles. And so we have to start building our own circles of citation, such that when I'm on a project, I'm never the only person on the project who's trans identified, and I'm never the only one. And so I think that there are many people working in this space, the door kicking space, if we're just going to call it that, And I think that that reflects the kinds of stories that arrive on screen, right? What's happening off screen has a direct impact on what's happening on screen. And you can tell when there are no trans people in the room. You can tell when there are no people of color in the room, because the representational practice is flat and superficial and is citational for all of the wrong reasons, because it's pulling on stereotypes and it's pulling on representative practices from the past. And so it's an exciting time to be making work, in my opinion, as a trans creator, because we are building visibility through numbers. It's a different kind of visibility, right? It's a kind of working visibility that says we're here and that we are in control of our creative choices.
Absolutely. So I guess I would be curious, or the audience might be curious, what might be the next creative choices that you would, you know.
Nathan, that was a very elegant segue.
I know. Please tell us.
Well, there are many things happening, but one project that I'll flag is I'm in development for a documentary called The Nest with a writer named Julietta Singh, who's an extraordinary thinker based in Richmond, Virginia. And together we're making a documentary that attempts to tell 140 years of Canadian history through the story of a single house, a single brick and mortar structure. So for all the ways that Agnes is pivoting on people, The Nest uses walls and space as a way to transport us through time.
It's a very interesting concept, and actually I think very original. Like, it's definitely looking forward to it. I think we're kind of here at the end of the Q&A, and I had a feeling that the way it went is the way it went, where really Nathan was going to take over and it was going to be a nice conversation between Nathan and Chase, and there was no need for me to interrupt it, because it was flowing, and it was just going to work out better that way.
We were just sitting over at the coffee house.
Yeah, exactly,
and all that type of things. The mission of the festival is really to entertain, empower, and enlighten. And you kind of hit it on in some of your comments. It's important to enlighten people about the history. Very often, the queer community is written out of history, and it's important that storytellers in our community tell our stories. And you've done that excellent job through your career in general. But it also helps educate, people across generations that just don't know this history, or people that just might get forgotten. You mentioned initially some of your inspirations were like the AIDS activists things, and like one of the things, like especially in 2021, there was a lot of documentaries that were about ACT UP and AIDS activists, which I wasn't aware of. Connie Norman, the artist David, I always massacre his last name, in New York, that these are people that we should be aware of. And to what your doc is doing, is this is a story that we should be aware of, and letting people know that we've always existed, trans people have always existed. It is not a new thing. Enlighten our own community, enlighten people outside our community, and quite frankly, like, as you said, like, empower people to do something about it. And I just want to get my 2 cents in there. But
thanks, Victor.
But no, and then definitely no. Thank you both for taking the time to do part of this Q&A. Definitely the inputs that Nathan brought into it made it a very different one than I would, just because of his experience and both your shared experience and the whole scenario. So thank you very much, the both of you, for being a part of the Q&A today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Nathan. Such a pleasure.
And then for our audience watching, you can still watch Framing Agnes virtually from March 21st to the 27th. And you can catch this Q&A again, or for the first time, on our YouTube channel. And again, thank you, everybody. And that's it.
Thanks all.